Well, I'm glad that you're all here to come out on this cold evening. It's very nice of you, and I'm glad to see all of you here. My name is Franklin Keel. Chickasaw Saya. I am Chickasaw. And because our tribes were not in a lot of Western movies or on television, most people don't know anything about the Chickasaw. So I'll start off with telling you a little bit more about them. Let's see. How do I get this on here? I'm not a whiz and I accidentally touched the wrong button here.
Click to the side of it.
Click to the side.
Yeah, off the purple, click on the gray. I mean the tan.
The gray.
All the way to the side.
Ah. This is Katie. She's my superhuman helper, along with Keegan back there. Great, thank you. Anyway, Chickasaw Nation. In 1540, DeSoto explored what is now the southeastern United States. And when he did that, he traveled from the coast on into the interior. And as he met tribes along the way, he grabbed some of the populace there to use as porters for his supplies. And he came with 800 men. They had firearms, they had war dogs, and they had armor. And when they went into the smaller tribes there, the smaller tribes were unable to really defend themselves. And whenever DeSoto decided he wanted to travel on to other tribes, whether in other parts of the country, he would just grab some slaves. And if they tried to escape, he would use the war dogs, the large battle mastiffs, to chase them down and kill them. And he went on through the south there, and he took as much food as he wanted from the tribes. He treated them badly. And then he came to what is now Mississippi, and there he met the Chickasaw. The Chickasaw let him stay in their area for about 30 days, and then they attacked. And he effectively broke up DeSoto's exploratory party. DeSoto died of his wounds 30 days later, and his men retreated back in disarray. He broke DeSoto's tour of the South. And this is what a Chickasaw warrior looked like. That would probably be anywhere from the 1500s to the 1700s. Today, we have 66,000 Chickasaw citizens. In the 1830s, our tribes, along with the other 4 civilized tribes, were removed from the southeastern U.S. and put in Oklahoma. And each tribe there, the 5 tribes, had their own Trail of Tears. So the Cherokee is probably the most famous of those, but each of the other 4 tribes had a Trail of Tears also, because they were removed from their homelands there and put in a country in Oklahoma that they had really never been in, except when their first scouts went out to determine if the land was acceptable. A little bit about the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Headquarters in Washington. There are 12 regional offices located throughout the country. Mine was the Eastern region. There are 83 agency and field offices and 3 sub-agencies and 2 irrigation project offices. And in 2018, they had about 6,700 employees. The total budget for the Bureau of Indian Affairs is, in FY 2018, was $2.5 billion. That's about half the U.S. aid given to Afghanistan each year. And as for the laws applying to the business of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it's 25 U.S.C., 25 U.S. Code. It's the only title of the U.S. Code that is dedicated to an ethnic group. And as you can see, the name of it is Indians. And this is just informational. Seems like everybody I meet says Indians get a check from the government every month. No, they don't. However, if you do know where I need to go to get one, please let me know. And questions by now? How did I get into the Bureau of Indian Affairs? That's I took a circuitous route. When I was growing up, for whatever reason, I grew up in an Indian family. My mother was full-blood Choctaw Chickasaw. My dad was half Chickasaw, a little over half actually. And when you're Indian, the first thing you know is that you are Chickasaw or Apache or Navajo. Then you learn your name. But it's that important and vital to who you are and what your culture is. And somehow along the way, I developed the desire to help Indians. I didn't have any certain plan as to how I would do that, but I knew that just somehow that's what I wanted to do. And my ancestors were leaders of the Chickasaw Nation, leaders and chiefs. And tonight I bring you greetings on their behalf of peace and friendship. I'm glad you're here. And what I originally wanted to do was to gain some solid experience in a field and gain valuable experience which would be transferable to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And I learned that I could take a test for the U.S. government, and my chances of getting a job there were better than they were in Oklahoma. I passed the Federal Service Entrance Exam and received a job offer from the Naval Weapons Laboratory in Virginia. So I accepted the offer, traveled out there, and I'd been there about 6 months whenever I learned that I had passed the Foreign Service Officer exam also. So I took that opportunity. And after almost a year's training in Greek language and area studies, I was posted to Athens, Greece, the agency there. And Greece was, at the time, under a right-wing dictatorship. My first year in Athens, I did well. I had already qualified in the Greek language, and oddly enough, I was able to prevent an international incident, which is unusual for a junior officer. And believe me, it's not something you pray about to have, because it can destroy your career in an instant if it doesn't go well. But I lucked out, if you will, and because of those things, I earned my first promotion. And I tell you this not to tell you how wonderful I was, but to let you know that it looked like I had a really good career ahead of me. So then I was given a developmental assignment as acting administrative officer while the incumbent officer went on home leave. When you're in foreign service, they send you home every 2 years for 3 months, so you can keep in touch with America, with your families, and go back for consultation, that sort of thing. But it's viewed as a career enhancement, not a vacation. And when I was in that position temporarily, I discovered very quickly that some of our Greek employees who are defrauding the U.S. government. And whenever the American managing officer there came back, and I reported that to him because I had asked for an embassy security investigation. The investigation verified that they were defrauding us. There was dual identities, fake names, that kind of stuff going on, and they were taking American money. And whenever their supervisor, the American supervisor, came back, and I told him about this, the first words out of his mouth were, "Well, we can't rock the boat." And I didn't appreciate that. So our managing officer there in Athens said, "Tell you what, you go ahead and report this to our inspection team. They're coming in about a month or so, and tell them everything, and I'll back you up." I said, "Okay." So when the inspectors got there from Washington, I had a 3-hour interview with one of the inspectors and told them everything, what had happened, how I'd verified it with an investigation, and that it was true. And I told them what their American supervisor had said. And at the end of the interview, he says, "Well, I can do something about that, but I'm not going to. I refuse to ruin a fellow officer's career." And I remember looking at him and thinking, you know, in 20 years, I do not want to be like these men. And at the time, I had a 9-month-old son. And I wanted to be someone that my son could respect. And I didn't think that if I stayed in that environment, or if I did what they wanted me to, I wouldn't be happy with who I was becoming. So at about the same time, I received news from Oklahoma that one of my uncles had been picked up by the police in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and had died in police custody. And this was an alcohol-related offense. It wasn't a serious crime, but he died in custody, and nothing was done about it. And between the two incidents with my senior officers and my uncle, I decided that I was going to resign my commission, go back to law school, and hopefully go look for helping Indians and poor people. Usually they're the same. And you have to remember that this was in the 70s, and with the turmoil of Vietnam, Watergate, and back then our generation was very active, and they wanted to change the status quo. And there were two ways to do that. One was that you fought the system, or fought the government, and the other was that you worked within the system to change it, to make it better. And I chose the latter one. And shortly after law school, I was offered a job with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and in their Congressional Affairs Office in D.C. So I went back there. And that's how I got into the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It wasn't an automatic thing. I had to come around to it, and I think that benefited me because I had an even greater commitment there when I did find that career in a way of achieving what I had originally dreamed of. And I call tonight's presentation Walking the Tightrope because in the field of Indian Affairs, there's a constant interplay between serving Indians honorably and being an employee of the U.S. government and serving that employer honorably. And as I talk about my work with the Bureau tonight, I hope you will keep in mind the words of one of the earliest statutes regarding American Indians, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Article 3. The utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. Their land and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. And in their property, rights, and liberty They shall never be invaded or disturbed unless adjusted to lawful wars authorized by Congress. But laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them and for preserving peace and friendship with them. Keeping those words in mind, here are some of the kinds of challenges that I found in working for the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is within the department. The first is entrenched departmental bias against Indians. One example of this is, as a part of the Eastern region, we had two tribes down in Florida, the Miccosukee and the Seminole tribe of Florida, and they live in the Everglades. That's their ancestral home. And I was working with the Park Service, the superintendent of the Park Service down there. He was the superintendent of Everglades National Park. We were on a phone conversation. And the third party to that conversation was a political appointee in the department. And in the course of this, then the reason Indian tribes' interests had to be observed or respected was because any federal action within the Everglades had to take those into consideration. And so I represented those tribes as the Eastern Director. And during the course of this conversation, it got a little heated. And the park superintendent there said, look, I don't think the Indians have any right to be in the Everglades. And during the Seminole Wars, the Miccosukee and the Seminole hid in the Everglades to hide from the U.S. soldiers that were searching for them. And the Seminoles and Miccosukees had been there for who knows how long. Park Service was created in 1916. The Everglades National Park was created in 1947. But he said the Indians didn't belong there. And I would love to say that I won every battle, but I didn't. I don't think I was able to change his mind. But another example of that kind of feeling toward Indians is that there was an American Indian who was the director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And one of the higher level political appointees in the secretary's office told him during a performance evaluation that he was too pro-Indian. And a few months later, another Indian was in the job who was more amenable to what the political appointee wanted. And another example is agency versus agency conflict. And I ran onto this during my first year on the Congressional Affairs staff of the Bureau. In the 1920s, over 1,000 acres of prime forest land was taken from the Tule River Indian Reservation because of a surveyor and an unscrupulous U.S. senator. They just carved that land out of the survey, and it was no longer Indian land. And as I said, keep in mind the words of the Northwest Ordinance as you hear these things. And at that time, a California congressman had introduced a bill to return the lands to the Indians. And Forest Service, who was the current custodian and owner of that land, didn't want to return it. Their attorney, their head attorney there, didn't care how the land was obtained. He wanted it to remain in Forest Service hands. And I was the one tasked with writing a report on that bill, and I opposed that point of view. And whenever you have two agencies who have opposing points of view for a piece of legislation, OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, will usually call you over unless they have a preconceived knowledge of what the, or opinion of what the decision should be. And they will let you fight it out, essentially. And one with the most persuasive argument has that position adopted as the administration position, the position of the president. And so he made his pitch that the Indians had no business to have the land, even though it had been stolen. He acknowledged that. But he said, we wanted Forest Service hands. And fortunately, I was able to discuss that a little more clearly, I hope, and pointed out that, yes, land was indeed stolen by unscrupulous people intentionally, and that the title to stolen property remains in the true owner. And the OMB examiner adopted my position. And whenever the bill was enacted by both houses of Congress and sent to the president for signature, the documentation I wrote and the recommendation I had there was the president's position, and he signed that bill, and today it is Public Law 96338. And the Truly River Tribe got their 1,100 acres back. And then you have a problem with, or I should say challenge, of political policy versus law. In Title 25, Section 151 of the Code of Federal Regulation, there are procedures in place based on the 1934 Act, the Indian Reorganization Act, which allow lands to be taken in trust by the U.S. government and held in their name to protect those lands. And the intention of that 34 Act was to help Indian tribes regain some of their land base if possible, through purchase or otherwise. And normally applications for this, under this regulation, were reviewed by a regional office for legal sufficiency. And then if everything looked good and all those hoops had been jumped through, the regional director, using delegated authority from the Secretary of the Interior, could sign the approval. But for about 4 years under one administration, this process was effectively short-circuited because one of the political appointees did not like that provision of law and regulation. By memo, he directed that all applications be sent in from the regional offices for review there at central office, and they could not be approved until they had had the review completed. And of course, as you can imagine, the result was that none of those applications were reviewed. So they never came back to us for approval. And we were unable to get any of those applications approved until the next administration came in. And getting an approval like that is very expensive for the tribe. They have to pay for environmental assessments or an environmental impact statement. They have to do all sorts of studies to make sure that it's clean environmentally and make sure that the land description is accurate, that sort of thing. So it's a big deal, and it's a lot of work, and it's very expensive. But for 4 years, none of those approvals were made. The next is political careerism. In 2014, before I retired, I attended a meeting there in Washington. My office was in Nashville, but I flew into DC to be at the meeting. And it was in the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs office. And whenever I got there, I was prepared to present our interpretation of a law which had been enacted in the 1990s, which allowed a tribe in one state to open gaming operations in an adjoining state. The tribe in the adjoining state objected to that. But It was authorized by federal law. There was no two ways about it. And so I explained that position, and the Assistant Secretary listened, who was Indian, by the way. And then about 6 attorneys, including a former Secretary of the Interior, gave their views on it, and they all agreed with what I had said. And the Assistant Secretary actually clenched his chest and leaned back in his chair and said, "I'm an Indian gaming expert. Why don't I know about this?" And the real answer to that question was, because you didn't read the 3-page briefing paper I personally prepared for you and sent to you last week. But he ignored that. And he was afraid that if he made the right decision, that there might be a lawsuit and his political reputation would be ruined within the department. So that's political careerism at its worst, I think. And had he made that decision, he would have enabled the tribe to take a great step forward in its economic development. And the state they were located in steadfastly fought any efforts to develop economically all sorts of businesses, but the adjoining state, where they would be going, was welcoming them with open arms. And my mantra, when I was the regional director, was that economic development for Indians is success for everybody. When the Indians open a business, they need to buy supplies from local vendors in that state who are non-Indians. They provide jobs for non-Indians, and everybody benefits. With a 3-to-1 multiplier effect, that can mean a lot of money depending on the kind of business. But some states just didn't want to do that because of long-seated prejudices against Indians. And the 5th is building trust and credibility. I found that, and this is, as you can see, there is no secret to diplomacy. It is like Ms. Maxfield Barrett said in her introduction to the night of UCCD. It's a matter of respect for other people, regardless of whether it's a nation or a group of people or your fellow citizens or family or friends. Respect has got to be there. Honest, good, sincere respect. That's the only way that people will ever get along. And this happened in 1995, when I had just been appointed acting director of the Eastern Region. A governmental crisis arose on the Seneca Reservation in New York. And the cause of that was that there were 2 political factions within the tribe who each said that they were the legitimate, rightful leaders of the tribe. And the political disagreement quickly turned into armed conflict. And by armed conflict, I mean they had hunting rifles, any kind of weapon, and the 2 factions took over various buildings on the reservation and essentially shut down the tribal government. And that is a very harmful thing for a tribe, because it can not only destroy the tribal government, but it rips apart the culture and relationship among the tribal citizens. So I knew that something had to be done. And I formulated a plan and implemented it. I guess I should point out that probably in the most tragic part of this political disagreement was that one night, one group drove past one of the buildings occupied by their opponents and fired some shots into the building, and 3 people were killed. And unfortunately, one of the people killed, one of the men, was the father of one of the shooters. So the tribe was really in a pretty bad state emotionally. And I mentioned how important respect is. There were 2 primary Bureau policies and responsibilities that I had to keep in mind as I did this. First is that Indian tribes are quasi-sovereign entities. They have the right to choose their own government and the type of government as well as their leaders. And the responsibility of the Bureau there is not only to respect that, but as a government and as a regional director, I had to be sure that any federal funds directed to tribal programs were given to the rightful legal tribal officials. So I called the parties and invited them to a meeting in my office in DC, neutral ground, and asked them to have a ceasefire, to not allow their proponents to engage in any sort of behavior that would be harmful. And they accepted my offer. They came to DC, and I allowed each party to make their case as to why they were the legitimate government. And fortunately, during the 10 days before my decision was issued, both sides upheld the truce. There was no more violence. And when I issued my decision, the party that did not prevail had the right to appeal my decision to the Interior Board of Indian Appeals. And they did this. And the good part about that was that it was a peaceful response. It wasn't one of anger or violence. And they appealed, and the IBIA issued a judgment validating my decision. And yeah, that made me feel good that they validated my decision. But the important thing was that the Seneca Nation was at peace again. And there was no more violence. And during that process, I had to establish trust and credibility with other parties who were observing or actually had a part in that. And they were the U.S. Department of Justice, the New York congressional delegations, the New York State Attorney General's office, and local sheriffs and other law enforcement agencies up there. And what I had to do was to make sure that these people, I had to be very careful about this. I had to dispel any harmful rumors, and I had to explain very carefully what the Bureau policy was and what I had hoped to achieve by my actions. And I also had to deal with the national and local media, both print and television. So it was, like I said, it was sort of like walking a tightrope. And again, with peace established on the reservation, the wonderful part of that is that today, 20 years later, they are still peaceful, their government is stable, and they are making economic progress. And that was the original intent. So I was very happy about that. And right now, and the good part is that in terms of whatever public diplomacy was involved, the result was that I established trust and credibility. Because you have to have that along with respect. People have to know that they can trust what you're saying, and they can believe that you will never lie to them. And that was one thing that when I dealt with the tribes, I never lied to them. I couldn't do that. And otherwise they wouldn't have respected me, especially as a fellow Indian. And now I've talked a little bit about the Bureau and my work. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about American Indian contributions to U.S. history and culture. And I know a real good spot to start, Chickasaw Nation. But and this is during a time in the early 1700s where France had laid claim to that part of the South, Mississippi, and they wanted to control the lower Mississippi, and the Chickasaws disagreed. So the French were insulted, they were going to teach the Chickasaws a lesson. So about 600 French troops, along with some Choctaws, attacked the village of Acquia, what is now the city of Tupelo in Mississippi, in March of 1736. Although outnumbered, the Chickasaws prevailed. And there's our Chickasaw warrior again. You'll notice the shaved head, and these are Eastern Woodland Indians. And then there was a second battle in Acquia in May, a couple of months later, 1736. Bienville himself came, the French governor there, decided that he would really teach the Chickasaws a lesson. And this time he brought 1,600 troops, French, and again the Choctaws and some other tribes. And they attacked the villages in Acquia. But the Chickasaws at that time were about 600, so they were outnumbered by over 1,000. And again, the French did not prevail. The Chickasaw won. Most historians agree that the Chickasaws prevented France from keeping their hold on that part of what is now the U.S. So, a friend of mine discussing DeSoto's incursion and the Chickasaw defeat of DeSoto, and this, he once said, well, you know, if it weren't for your people, we might have all been speaking Spanish or French now. And the Chickasaws were great warriors. Have you ever heard of 300 Spartans from Greece? The one early observer called the Chickasaws the Spartans of the lower Mississippi. They lived for battle, and if necessary, the women would fight beside the men. This is what a Chickasaw village would have looked like back then. And you can see the wooden palisades around them, surrounding the village. And that's how their houses looked. They had kind of a thatched roof. And the walls were made out of tree trunks. But that is the recreated village there at our cultural center in Oklahoma. And further contributions by American Indians were made during the Revolutionary War. The Oneida Nation was the only one of the Iroquois Confederacy to support the new U.S. government. And in 1777-78, at Valley Forge, the soldiers were starving. Iroquois Nation sent down 100 young Indian men with baskets of corn, white corn on their back. And with them was a young lady by the name of Polly Cooper. And her purpose there, along with the young men, was to help the soldiers learn how to properly prepare the corn. Because if they didn't prepare it properly, it could have made them sick. And she knew how to do that, and she taught the soldiers. And as a result, that helped them make it through the winter at Valley Forge. And the Washingtons took a liking to her, and she lived with them while she was there. And in gratitude and affection, they gave her a bonnet and a purse. And her descendants still have those to this day in New York with the Oneida Nation. And this picture is was taken at the National Museum of the American Indian. And that's the statue of Holly Cooper, and that's the great tree of peace. That's behind me there, it's a pine tree. And I think the chief's name was Shenandoah, or Shenandoah, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And George Washington, of course. And the man there in front is the current leader of the Oneida Nation of New York. And the man in the background is Kevin Gover. He's Comanche. He's the director of the Museum of the American Indian. Indians were also involved at a later time. This is General Stan Waddy. He was an Oklahoma Cherokee, and he was the last Confederate general to surrender. He surrendered 75 days after Appomattox. And he was evidently a pretty good general, a good warrior. And now a little bit of social history about that era. In about the 1850s, there was an example of this. There was a young Indian, Seneca, and he studied for the law, but he was unable to gain a license in New York because he was Indian. He was not a U.S. citizen. So he changed his plans, became an engineer, and he went to work for the Department of the Treasury. And they sent him out to Galena, Illinois to build a customs house. And while he was there, he became friends with an ex-Army captain who was a clerk in his father's store. The young Indian was Ely Parker, and the ex-Army captain was Ulysses S. Grant. And whenever General Grant was recalled to the Army, he brought Ely Parker with him. And Ely Parker, having been trained as an attorney, but unable to practice, actually hand-wrote, drafted the surrender agreement. That was signed by General Lee and General Grant. And he said that whenever Lee walked in, and he came over to him and shook his hand and said, "Well, I'm glad that there's at least one American here, one real American." And he wrote later, I shook his hand and said, "Sir, we are all Americans." And if you go to Appomattox Courthouse today, you will see a big portrait, probably 8 by 10 feet, and Ely Parker is there. And in the 20th century, probably one of the most well-known athletes was Jim Thorpe. And in the 1912 Summer Olympics, he won gold medals in the pentathlon and decathlon. He was the first American Indian to win Olympic medals for the U.S. And he also, he could play any sport, and he was outstanding at it. In 1950, the Sports Writers of America voted him as the outstanding athlete of the half century. And he was extremely good. As I said, at that time, before the big college leagues were formed, Carlisle Indian School, where he studied, would play colleges. And one of the schools they played was West Point. And on the other team was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who later became president. And Eisenhower said, he said, when Jim Thorpe was on the field, there was no question as to who was in command. And I was told the other day, and I couldn't find any information on it, but a friend said that at the Olympics, he also beat George S. Patton, who was on the Olympic team. But one of the things he did when he was playing Carlisle Indian School against the University of Pennsylvania, he actually he punted the ball, ran downfield, caught his own punt, and ran a touchdown. If you can imagine that happening today. And in 1917, during World War I, when the Allied victory was still in the balance, the Germans had effectively breached all communications. They shot down the carrier pigeons, they captured or killed the messengers, and they tapped into the field telephone lines. So the Allies couldn't do anything that the Germans did not know about. And one day, an American officer was walking along and he heard 3 Choctaws from Oklahoma speaking Choctaw. And he said, what language are you talking? And they said, Choctaw, it's our language. And so he had an idea. And what he did was get training for these young men. These are 3 of them. And they used the Choctaw language as the first code talkers in the military in 1917. And of course, the Allies won the war. In fact, they played such an important role that that France inducted them into the National Legion of Merit as Knights of the National Legion of Merit in 1989. And in the 1920s, there was a woman who was a Chickasaw, and her stage name was Teata, which is bearer of the morning. And she was an actress and a folklorist, and she brought Indian culture and history to the entire world for 70 years. She began in the 1920s, and she performed on Broadway for the King of England and at the Roosevelt White House. And she actually became a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. In 1976, Ladies Home Journal recognized her as Woman of the Year. And in 1987, she became the first person, not just first woman, but the first person to be deemed an Oklahoma treasure. And our tribe has made a movie about her, and it's called Teata, if you'd ever like to watch it. Also in the 1920s and 30s was Will Rogers. He was Cherokee from Oklahoma. He was a humorist, trick roper, vaudeville and Broadway performer, had a newspaper column, and was a radio star of his day. And people loved his sense of humor, they loved him, they loved his movies, and he was extremely popular. And one of his sayings, one of the things he wrote, was that, we really shouldn't make fun of our congressmen and senators, because after all, they are the best money can buy. And he loved aviation, he loved to fly. And he used his status as a popular celebrity to lobby Congress to establish the U.S. as a major air power. He did that before World War II for some. And unfortunately, he died in 1935 when an airplane crashed with the famous aviator Wiley Post. In World War II, there was Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Childers. He earned the Medal of Honor and was the second most decorated U.S. soldier of World War II. At Oliveto, Italy, in 1944, while injured, Second Lieutenant Childers single-handedly killed 2 German snipers and knocked out 2 machine gun nests and captured German mortar reservoir. And at Iwo Jima, one of the Marines there at the raising of the flag was Ira Hayes. He was a Pima from Arizona. And of course, that famous picture became the basis for the U.S. Marine Memorial there in Arlington. And then again, you had code talkers. Probably the most well-known of the code talkers in World War II were the Navajos. They trained about 300 of them, and they still use other tribes, but I think there were more Navajos than the other tribes in the various services. And their exploits are well known, and they helped them in winning the war in the Pacific Theater. In the Korean War, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Harvey, he was Chickasaw. He, as a young captain, he single-handedly took out 3 machine gun nests. Then, after suffering a chest wound, took out a 4th machine gun replacement. And he was given the Medal of Honor for that. And the interesting thing about him is that in World War II, he had already earned the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, and 2 Purple Hearts. And in 1964, Billy Mills, who was an Oklahoma Sioux, won the 10,000-meter run, the first American to do so. Not just the first Indian, but the first American. And there's a really good movie, if you haven't seen it, called Running Brave, that was made about him. And it's pretty much factually accurate. It depicts what life was like for a young American Indian back then. In 1969, M. Scott Momaday of Kyle, he's a writer and poet, won the Pulitzer Prize for his novel, Housemaid of Dawn. He was also awarded the National Medal of Arts in 2007 for his body of work. In 1975, Will Sampson, who was an actor, he starred in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson. Yeah. And he was also in The Outlaw Josie Wales and several other movies. He was Muskogee from Oklahoma, what is also known as the Creek Nation. And Louise Erdrich, in 1984, she won the National Book Critics Circle Award for her novel, her debut novel, Love Medicine. And her novel, The Roundhouse, won the National Book Award for Fiction in 2012. And her other novel, she has several, Plague of Doves, won the Anisfield Wolf Book Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. I got to meet her when she came to Nashville at a book signing. Very nice lady. And in 2012, Commander John Harrington, a Chickasaw, became the first American Indian astronaut to go into space. The first American Indian to go into space. And again, in the arts, Wes Studi, Oklahoma Cherokee, has been an actor in many movies. His latest role was in Hostiles in 2018, and he was in the Academy Award-winning films Dances with Wolves and Last of the Mohicans, and the cable series Penny Dreadful more recently. Now a little bit about the Eastern region. I worked in that region for 17 years and served about 60,000 American Indian citizens, tribal citizens, and it's the largest geographic region in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And there were 28 tribes there when I was the director. And they range from Maine down to Florida or to Louisiana. And I couldn't have found a job I loved more. And now I'll show you a little bit more here. This is my tribe made this, the Chickasaw Nation made this about my career.
Advocating on a federal level, Chickasaw citizen Franklin Keel set the bar as an ambassador to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and served as a bridge between Indians and Washington, D.C. His drive to serve his fellow Native people was greatly influenced by his mother, a full-blood Chickasaw Choctaw, and his father, who was also Chickasaw. The Keels had a humble life in Lawton.
I grew up in Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache country, and the local non-Indians hated those people, and they didn't like Indians. So that was tough.
Franklin graduated from the Oklahoma College of Liberal Arts and later earned his law degree from Oklahoma City University. Prior to earning his Juris Doctorate, Franklin became the first Native American commissioned as a Foreign Service Officer in the United States Diplomatic Corps. He represented the Chickasaw Nation and indigenous peoples across the globe. In 1997, Keel was appointed as the director of the Eastern Region for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where he served and represented 28 tribes with issues such as intertribal violence, land acquisition, and economic development.
It's very important that the BIA be involved in our governmental affairs.
It's a great thing to have the Bureau of Indian Affairs for you, working for you, because it comes with so many projects and grants and fundings that every tribe must have when they first start.
The tribes consider the BIA as their link to the United States. Frank would be the one that would be their liaison, their guide.
With his combination of policy experience and legal expertise, he brings the whole package together. They were able to rely on him for expert advice that they could trust.
I've dealt with a lot of tribal, and not only tribal, but a lot of federal BIA personnel and so forth. He's top shelf. When push comes to shove, he knew what he was doing and he'd do what was right.
His genuine passion for service to Native Americans was evident to everyone with which he worked.
And he didn't take sides, he didn't have favorites. He treated them all just alike.
I couldn't discriminate between small and large tribes. That didn't make any difference. They were all equal as far as I was concerned. As I told them my first day on the job, you tell me where you want to go, I'll help you get there.
Frank would jump on the plane at a phone call and run to see them if they needed him. He was very good to the tribes and vice versa.
But he gave us 100%, in my opinion. Frank gave it all, he didn't hold back.
Those kind of things are so important to a little small tribe that somebody's not forgot about you. It was not all about the salary, about the name or title. It wasn't about those things. It was about helping Indian people.
I wanted to see Indian tribes be strong economically in today's world, but yet retain the culture that is so important.
It was the preservation of culture, specifically the culture of his own tribe, which marked one of Franklin's career highlights. The placement of the ancient Chickasaw and Choctaw mound site, Naniwaya, into federal trust.
It's probably, for me, the capstone of my career with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This was something that would do something for everybody. Our children, our grandchildren, the ones that aren't yet born. But the people I really wanted to do it for were my grandparents and those who had gone before. Because without them, we'd have nothing today. That's why I'm glad I did that. Now our sacred ground to be protected forever for all of us.
Another great accomplishment was his assistance to the tribes in his region when Hurricane Katrina struck in 2005.
Those tribes in Mississippi had no help at all because FEMA was having such a hard time down along the coastlines. And it became apparent to Frank that if we didn't step in and try to help those tribes, then no one was going to do it. Frank carved out almost $500,000 from the regional office, and he decided that we were going to use that money to help those tribes, and that's exactly what we did.
Franklin served those 28 tribes with the BIA for 17 years before his retirement in 2014.
When you think about over that many years of a career, 37 plus years, the number of lives affected for not only this generation, but the generations to come, I think that's quite extraordinary for one lifetime.
I think he made Indian country a much better place. He takes care of people and he doesn't stop until it's finished. And I think that he is of the mold that that's exactly what Chickasaws are about. The tribe could not have picked anybody any better than Frank Keel.
Please welcome Franklin Keel to the Chickasaw Hall of Fame.
Well, I thank you for coming out tonight, and I hope you know a little bit more about American Indians than you did when you walked in. And I hope that each of you would remember that we still have a place that we have earned in American society. And I hope that when you think of American Indians, you keep in mind the words of the poet, James Weldon Johnson. Every race or nation should be judged by the best it has been able to produce, not by the worst. Thank you.
Frank?
Yes.
I have a pretty loud voice, so I don't know if the mics are here or not, but I wondered, where is the sacred mound located?
That sacred mound is located in Mississippi. That was the original homeland of the Chickasaws and the Choctaws. The Choctaws and Chickasaws were originally the same tribe. And according to their migration letter, they were led by two brothers, Chickasaw and Choctaw. And they traveled for a long time. And they, each night they would place a staff in the ground. And when they woke up the next morning, they would look at the staff. And if it had fallen, they would follow that direction. And whenever they came to Naniwaya, as my wife was pointing out today to some friends, one story says that the staff was rotating, and the other was that it was standing perfectly still. And they said, "This is the end of our journey." And a Choctaw traditional person told me, he said, "Well, you know, Chickasaw was the more rowdy of the two brothers, and he decided he didn't want to stay there, so he moved his followers elsewhere. They became the Chickasaw Nation, and the Choctaws remained there. And it's in Mississippi, just outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi. It's actually a part of a mound complex, and one of them is really big and the others are smaller. But I don't know how true this is, but the non-Indian caretaker there told me once when I went out there. He said there's a cave under there, and he said they have never been able to explore it, because if they took a coal oil lantern, it would go out. If they tried a pine knot that was lit, it would go out. And if they took flashlights, they would go out. So, like I said, I don't know how true that story is, but that was what the caretaker there told me. And at that time, when I talked to him, the Mellon was a state park. Subsequently, in the land trade, was given back to the tribe. And that's when I took the opportunity to make the Naniwaya Mound a part of America's sacred landscapes.
So is it protected territorially with the tribe then, or is that considered, say, under the same umbrella as a national monument?
Yeah, it's actually, Indian lands are separate.
Yes.
Whenever land is taken into trust for a tribe, it is feeling, which is land like you own your house or a piece of property. And whenever the U.S. accepts that transfer, it is held by the United States for the tribe. It can never be alienated. That's how it's protected.
Thank you.
I'm curious to understand more if I'm going to research more about how the government works on Native American lands versus like the tribal government versus Bureau of Indian Affairs versus federal or state governments, where could I find more information about that?
Excuse me, could you repeat that?
Okay, so sorry, that was very roundabout. I'm doing research on 911 services on Native American reservations, and I'm wondering where I can find more information about jurisdictions for tribal government versus state and federal governments.
Probably you could go down here to the University of Utah Law School, or you could go to, there's a professor there, Alex Skibine, and he's Osage. And he used to work on the House Interior and National Affairs Committee, but he's a professor down there now. And of course, he used to have Larry Eckhoff, who was a professor of law at BYU. But either one of those places could help you with that. I'm sure they'd be glad to.
Thank you.
I have a question. In the 80s, the economic driver from then on a lot of Indian reservations was gaming. How do you see the native lands and economic drivers moving forward in a sustainable manner in the 21st century on native lands?
Well, actually, the most successful tribes have a diversified portfolio, if you will. The Mississippi Choctaw that I worked with under the leadership of Philip Martin, he was one of the greatest Indian leaders of the 20th century. Actually had a harness, automobile harness, electric harness building plant down there. They had a hallmark factory. They did other things before they got into gaming. But you're absolutely right. Gaming is cyclical, and it's better some years than others. Many people have look upon it as an immoral activity, but you know, alcohol and tobacco are bad for you. But are they legal? Yes. So is gaming. Indians cannot game according to the Indian Gaming Act in a state that does not permit gaming. Once upon a time, there was a loophole back in the 1980s, and Congress, under pressure from the owners of the non-Indian casinos in Las Vegas, pretty much shut that down. And wherever you have an Indian casino these days, there's usually been in the background an agreement worked out whereby the state always gets a cut of that money. They get a part of the profit rather than having it belong to the tribe. And however you want to view that, the state of Connecticut doesn't particularly like its Indian populations, the two tribes there, the Mohegans and the Mashantucket Pequot, but they sure love the money. The income from those two casinos there bailed out Connecticut, kept it from bankruptcy. And whenever a Mohegan Sun opened, which is a beautiful casino, and I don't gamble myself, I cry for days if I lose a quarter. But I took the shuttle when I went up there for the grand opening, and a woman was driving the shuttle, and I said, "Are you a member of this tribe?" And she said, "No, I'm not." I said, "What do you think of this?" She said, "I think it's the most wonderful thing that has ever happened." She said, "I used to work an electric boat. They used to build submarines up there in Groton." And she said, "When the plant closed, I was out of a job, and now I have a job." And she said, "They pay well, and you better believe I'm glad to have this job, and I'm glad they're here." And one time, when I was in Washington, I had 7 gentlemen from Massachusetts come down from Fall River, and they said, "You know, our town has lost its economic base. We used to have mills and factories there, but they all moved away. They went overseas. Our people have no jobs. And we're here today on our own dime. We're paying our way down here ourselves. And what we came here to ask is there any way that you could get a Massachusetts tribe to open a casino for us in our town?" And as I mentioned earlier, my constant refrain when dealing with state, tribal leaders or congressional leaders, U.S. senators or congressmen, was that success for Indian citizens is success for everybody. And it's true. Yes.
Does any of your experience provide any insight on the Oklahoma treaty lands discussion that's happening now? And if so, could you explain that a little bit to us?
I didn't work in Oklahoma. This happened after I retired, but evidently a person in this creek called Muskogee had killed another creek and on what is Indian land. And he was sentenced to die, I believe, had a death sentence there in Oklahoma. And his lawyer came up with a new approach, a new argument, which was that because the crime occurred on Indian land, that only the federal government or a tribe has the jurisdiction to arrest that person and try them, not the state as happened here. And it's under appeal at the Supreme Court right now. Any other questions?
Okay, I have 3. Are the names, it seemed like most of the names that you showed us, the Indian heroes were European American. Do they take that to assimilate, so they'll be like European Americans? When, that's number 1. Number 2 is, when did the Native Americans get to vote? And number 3, you talked about an administration that would not review, whatever, I can't remember. And so nothing happened for 4 years. You also talked about states that would not or would allow the casinos. Is there a reason that you didn't say what the name of the administration was? Like who was the president, or the names of the states?
Well, I'll answer your last question first, because that's the one I most clearly understood. I didn't mention the particular administration because in my years in Washington, I found that political party was not really an indicator of who was going to be helping Indians. Richard Nixon, under his administration, passed the Indian Self-Determination Act, which is a really important act for Indians. And regardless of what you think about him, he also took Taos Blue Lake for the tribes down there in Arizona. So either administration can help Indians. There is no clear line as to who's good and who's bad. It just depends upon the personality of the Secretary of the Interior, or in some cases the personality of the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. And your other three questions, I didn't understand those
You
clearly.
mentioned that Native Americans couldn't vote because they were not citizens of the United States. I assume they can now, and when did that change?
Okay. No, what I mentioned actually was about Ely Parker. He couldn't get into the New York bar because he was not a U.S. citizen. And most people think that in 1926, American Indians received the right to vote, which they did. But that was not the first time that Indians were allowed to vote and be U.S. citizens, because there were many treaties, not many, but a few, which as a part of the treaty terms made American Indian citizens, but not all American Indians. And that didn't occur until 1926.
And the European type names, I'm just curious, like, do the Indian tribes not use their, I don't want to say the words wrong, but their indigenous names because they want to assimilate with the European Americans, or are
No.
those their birth names?
No, not at all. Some people have Indian names still, others don't. Human nature being what it is, there was intermarriage, and sometimes if the father had an English name or a Scotch name or a French name, that's the name they took, whatever their culture said they would. And I've known Indians who go by several names. One man I knew had a Anglo-Saxon last name, but he changed it to Big Eagle, which was his mother's maiden name, so that the Indianness would be recognized. But no, they didn't adopt English-sounding names just to assimilate. It occurred like the same way if you're Italian and your grandmother married a German, you might have a German name today. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Welcome. Thank you. It's good to see you.
I was also going to ask about being U.S. citizens. Are the Indians considered like dual citizens because they're members of the tribe as well as being U.S. citizens? And does that ever conflict?
Not in the same sense that you're considered a dual citizen internationally. You can retain if tribes establish who is an Indian by their own rules. Each tribe can make its own rules and make that determination. And most tribes either do it by descendancy or they have it by blood quantum. And in my case, I have a blood quantum, but our tribe determines who is a citizen by descendancy. If you have an Indian ancestor who was on the Dawes Rolls of 1907, you can become a citizen of my tribe. With other tribes, you have to have a certain blood quantum, or some tribes are matrilineal. You're not an Indian, not a citizen of that tribe unless your mother was. So it just varies according to each tribe.
So I just want to thank Franklin Keel for coming tonight. If I can up a little bit higher, thank you guys. My name is Jennifer Hamilton. I'm the event coordinator, so that's why I'm speaking. I'm not just another person. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you all for coming.